Welcome to the Business Success Strategies with Adrian McLean. This is a 30-minute interview with successful business people who have been able to achieve amazing results with growing a business. Business Success Strategies is proudly sponsored by The Speaker's Practice and AdrianMcLean.com, helping business owners with marketing and promotions with a specialty with public speaking. Enjoy today's Business Success Strategies interview.
Welcome and thanks everyone for joining us for the Business Success Strategies interview. Hi, I'm Adrian McLean from the Speaker's Practice. Our Business Strategies interviews are showcasing incredible professionals who specialise in helping businesses with profitability and growth. Today, our topic is unravelling the wisdom of 5 brains for successful selling. Our guest, Dr. Leanne Elich, is an award-winning sales psychologist and business strategist, recognised as a pioneering thought leader in the field of psychology and neuroscience, and this is applied to business. With over 25 years of global experience, she is one of Australasia's most successful technology business executives and a leading expert in high-performance teams. Leanne holds a PhD in cognitive neuropsychology and is a graduate of the University of Sydney, Harvard Business School and Harvard Medical School. I've been so excited to have Leanne join us for our Business Success Strategies interview, as we're all wanting to understand the psychology behind selling and understanding our buyers' thinking. Thanks, Leanne, for joining us.
No, thank you for having me. It's great to be on the show, on the webinar, and I know we've been planning to do it for a while, and we're finally here, which is great. And what a way to kick off the new year with a bang!
Yes, literally.
Literally. No, it's great, and we've done some work together in the past, and it's been phenomenal. One thing I also just wanted to bring up, because it's something I'm just really proud of. And thanks for reading out my bio. And when people read out my bios, I think, oh, geez, it's a lot of stuff that I've done. But I just love it. Yeah. I love it so much. But just in context of what we're going to be talking about today, on the 5th of January, so just recently, I've been accredited and appointed as a master neuroplastician with the International Society of Organisational Neuroscientists. Wow. So there's actually only 3 of us in Australia that have accreditation. So that is something that I've been working towards, and I finally, passed all the all examinations and interviews of the advisory board, and it's quite a robust process. And I'm like, yay! And I got my certificate. So in context of what we're talking about today, I know some stuff is what I want to start.
You have a bio that goes on for pages, so
yeah, I do know some stuff.
You're amazing. So thank you so much for being with us. All right, look, let's get started with our slides and the questions, because this is there's some really interesting and valuable information that every business owner really is interested in finding out about and knowing about. So our topic today is unravelling the wisdom of 5 brains for successful selling. So if I can get my slides, there we are. So firstly, we really need to know, what is the wisdom of 5 brains?
Yeah, that's good. Unpacking what on earth are 5 brains. Well, anatomically, we have a brain that is a single brain, an organ, which is exceptional in the way that we operate, in the way that we think, and protects us, which is one of the main reasons why our brain is there and operates the way that it does. But when we break it down, and I'm not talking anatomically as in, your temporal lobe, occipital lobe, prefrontal lobe, but we're talking about the cognitive breakdown of the brain. We break it down into 5 areas. And I'm just going to show, because I've got some slides too, so it's easier for the audience to see, that the areas that we talk about when we talk about the 5 brains is our primitive brain, our limbic brain, our neocortex, our prefrontal cortex, and our heart brain. There's also a 6th brain, just so people are clear, which I'm not talking about today, but that's the gut brain. So that's the neurological connection between our brain and our gut. We've all heard about our gut being the 2nd brain, and how anything that happens neurologically and cognitively with the upregulation and downregulation of hormones actually affects our tummy and affects our metabolism, microbiome. But we're not talking about that. And that has only really been the last couple of years brought into the wisdom of the brain, is our 6th brain. But the 5 brains is what we're discussing today. And I've just said that just in case people go away and read and research about it, they might come up against it and read that 6th brain. So it all comes down to decision making and how we think. So there's 3 components of that. There's psychology, behavioral science, and neuroscience. And this is how we break down into our 5 brains. So when we look at how our brain really works, you can see here the mechanics, and I've got the gears here of the different brains, and I've labeled them. And I've also labeled 2 hormones that are especially affected in the way that we think, especially when we are selling and being sold to, which I know we're going to talk about a little bit later, but also what we do as humans in our behaviors. So if we go back, we have our primitive brain, which is at the back of our brain, which is also known as our reptilian brain. It's there for protection. So when we break it down, we talk about an acronym which is FAF, F-F-F-A-F. And we all know about flight and fright, which are the first 2 Fs. Then we've got freeze, appease, and faint. So our brain will switch off. It will secrete cortisol, our stress hormone, on purpose to protect us. We then have the limbic brain, which is actually our emotional center. It's where we build relationships. It's where we fit in. Where are we in the scheme of the social norms? Are we part of this group? Do we feel included? Do we feel excluded? I teach a lot of the limbic brain in leadership psychology, where you are leading a team, and we talk about psychological safety that agitates the limbic brain of being accepted, not being humiliated, being able to ask questions and have conversations safely in a mental space. And when I talk about psychological safety, which is a term that I believe is way overused, and it was coined from Professor Amy Edmondson from Harvard Business School, we talk about it. And what I want to bring to attention, and this is especially in the leadership, business, and sales world, is it's all very well to encourage a safe space when we are in a space with one another face to face. But so many times I have witnessed and also been experienced people walking out of a room, or walking out of a shop, or walking out of a meeting room, or a workplace or an office, and being talked about behind their back. That's not psychological safety, and that will agitate our limbic brain. The neocortex is hardwired for language, our memory, sensory, our thinking. Our main thinking and functions is our neocortex. Our prefrontal cortex is one of the most important parts, which sits here at the front, also known as our executive brain, is basically how we function. It is how we operate. I call it the orchestra conductor. It is the maestro of our entire central nervous system, which is how we operate, how we think, and how we make decisions. And then we have our heart brain. And our heart brain is also for building relationships, but it's also about appreciation, acknowledgement, thank you, please, those kinds of words and feelings that agitate our prefrontal cortex to increase oxytocin, our feel-good hormones. So if I just go back to the area here of our 5 brains, we can actually see that when we are activating our primitive brain, which remember is for protection, it releases a cortisol, which is a stress hormone, which makes us very insular. We start being exclusive. We judge. We limit our behaviors and our thinking. We withhold information. We think we know it all, and we're not willing to accept someone else's opinion or advice or guidance. We're dictating, and we're really quick to criticize. And then as we move across and agitate and include our limbic, our neocortex, and go into our prefrontal cortex, our executive brain, we release oxytocin. Oxytocin, we call it an oxytocin injection. It's like our endorphins, acetylcholine as well, also dopamine, but oxytocin is the main hormone that's secreted that makes us feel fantastic. We're really inclusive, we're appreciated, we're expanding, we collaborate, we share, we discover. And this is where really good business is done and where great relationships are fostered. The transaction of selling is secondary. The primary collaborative and relationship building is that's primary, and the transaction actually happens, and it happens with much more empowerment and enforcement. So breaking down the 5 brains and giving you a little bit of an understanding of each, I hope that's helped.
Yeah, that's amazing. The question comes, like, we don't consciously move from our primitive brain to our frontal brain. How does that process work?
So, no, you're right. We don't consciously do it. It is subconscious or part of the collective unconscious. And we are actually in control, even though it's subconscious, where there is a sense of control. So if we feel that we're in danger, we will move automatically from the front to the back. So from the green zone to the red zone. I'm just going to move on to, this is just explaining our prefrontal cortex. So we will actually move backwards and forwards. And our brain does it technically automatically, depending on the variables that we're up against, the ecosystems, the environment, people. Naturally, we are animals, so we are naturally surviving. That's what we do. And as you know, animals in the sense of animals will retreat, or they'll isolate themselves, or if they want comfort, they'll move in packs. We do the same thing. We are social creatures. We find comfort, which is why the limbic brain is so important, is where do we fit in? But if we are not trusting, and when you meet someone for the first time, and especially in a sales or business situation, and this is where the psychology of selling is so important. You've got someone that comes up to you. We've all experienced this, so, and me in particular, because I look for it. And you've got someone that's a bit sleazy and sneaky and yucky and slimy, and they're trying to sell you something. What's the first thing we do? We don't go forward and go, oh, great to meet you, and oh, tell me more and show me what your product is. We retreat. We activate on purpose our primitive brain to protect ourselves, and we push away. That's why the most common word you hear in sales is no. Even without understanding how the product can benefit you, if someone's trying to sell you something, we will put our hand up and go, no, I don't want to know. Because we do that on purpose to protect ourselves. That's why we need to engage in a totally different way. So no, you're right. We don't consciously move from the front to the back, but we do tend to understand our actions of what's happening and why we walk out of the store. We'll walk out going, oh, I didn't feel good. And that's because we've activated our primitive brain.
So is there a way to reverse that?
Yeah. So just to talk about the ability to way to reverse that.
Yes.
Well, so where I've got here, essential for our survival and basic functions, we don't want to reverse it in a sense. The main function of our brain is protection and survival. Obviously thinking and making decisions, but if we're dead, there's no decision to be made. I mean, I know that's extreme, but that's why.
Yes.
And that's why with FAF, where I have, the full acronym, which is flight, freeze, appease, faint, we actually faint. The reason why people, when they go into shock and they act and they're hurt, their pain is extreme, we faint. We switch off. That otherwise we would have cardiac arrest. So we purposely the brain puts our bodies into a state that is acceptable where we are. Now, of course, this is extreme when we're talking about business and sales, but I'm just trying to give you the fundamental understanding and the principles of what happens. So as a consumer, it is very hard to take control of that and say, walk into a store, or have a conversation with someone and say, I am not going to activate my amygdala today. I'm going to let someone just talk to me and sell to me. It's subconscious. We will automatically revert back into protection. But as the seller, or as the business owner, as the entrepreneur, as the founder, as the person that is engaging, we can actually control whether that person will stay, so whether the consumer will stay in their prefrontal cortex or automatically revert back to their primitive brain. So it is up to us as the experts and as the business experts, as the sellers, to engage in a way that is not going to push your consumer, customer, client into, and we're talking about especially in prospective clients. So clients that we currently have, we've started to build a relationship and we can manage them a little bit better. But prospective clients that we're bringing on board, or prospective business that's coming in, that is harder to manage. But we do have the tools, which we're going to talk about today, to keep people in that prefrontal cortex. And we talk about different types of conversations, which we'll get to in a minute. So yeah, I'll step into that as we go along.
It's quite it's fascinating, Leanne, when you describe moving from the prefrontal cortex back into the amygdala. In marketing terms, do business with people we know, like, and trust. We engage people in events and dinners and lunches and things to create safe environments. And it's really interesting. So from what you're saying, when we're doing our marketing and we're building that element of trust, it's more moving people forward.
Yeah, that's right. Look, I have a little bit of a problem with the know, like, and trust analogy, because there's so much more to it. As a neuroscientist, and I've done a lot of work in neuromarketing, I guess when we simplify it, you're right, Adrian, when we simplify it, it's know, like, and trust. If we need to know them, we need to like them, we need to trust them. But it's so much more than that. Because if what is trust? Do you trust someone? Is it for a minute, for a second, for a year, for 10 years? What is it? Breaking down why it is that you trust someone. But the thing is that you can trust someone and not like them. And that's where I have a problem, because likability, if we read a good book, and if anyone wants to know some recommended reading, I've got recommended reading on my website, and I'm happy to send through some suggestions. Dr. Robert Cialdini, a lot of his work, I've done a lot of stuff with his principles, the 7 principles of influence, psychology of persuasion. One of them is liking. Actually isn't trust. So I teach ethical influence in business and in sales. Trust is actually not a principle. It's liking. You need to make sure that you have a relationship with someone and you're activating that oxytocin. If you can't get past that, there is no trust. So even if you do trust someone, you mightn't like them. That trust will be, very, very brief. It's getting people into their prefrontal cortex and getting them remaining there and building a relationship that is not salesy. That is basically, I say to a lot of clients, and when I'm teaching, I say it's not about selling, it's about helping. What are you trying to solve? What problems do they have that you can help with? And a lot of people say to me, but Leanne, we can't help everybody. My background is actually as you know, Adrian, but for those on the webinar, is a clinician. Back in the day, I was I was a radiation oncologist with pediatrics. I felt I had a duty of care to help those if I could. So yes, it is a problem with saying no. We always want to help someone, but if you've got an expertise, if you've got or you've got a product, or you've got advice, or you've got guidance, or you've got a service that will help someone, that's the main thing. And getting them to understand that you can help them will activate the prefrontal cortex.
So being of service is really important.
It is, and it's showing that you actually are an expert in the field, and that and want to understand what the customers and clients' problem is. Quite often it won't be, you may not be able to help them. You may have to send them or recommend them to someone else, or it might be a certain service or product that they thought they needed, but it actually is something different. Identifying these things creates and builds this relationship that creates that likeness, or the likelihood of liking, which then goes into trust, which then activates the oxytocin. So we want to sit people in their prefrontal cortex as long as possible. We want to try and stop the activation of the primitive brain, which I'm actually going to talk about in a minute, but I think you've got a next question for me.
Well, it moves well into our next question, because we then have to understand how we behave as buyers. So how does this influence?
So there is a very a famous study. Well, I'll talk about actually what we do with our decision making, and it's not rational. And we think we're really rational, and people say, "Oh, I'm really rational. I know exactly what I'm thinking and what I'm doing." But actually, we don't have time to be rational. On a round table that I was at recently, and Adrian, you were there, I talked about the amount of information that we consume on a daily basis, and it's equivalent to 100, on average, 174 newspapers. So if we had a newspaper and we read it from the front, every single page, every single word, to the back, we looked at the pictures, we engaged with the imagery and translated that interpreted into what we understand. And we did that 174 times. That is how much information our brain consumes and translates on a daily basis. That is, yeah. So if that's what we're doing, how on earth can we be rational? And how on earth do we have time to make decisions that are always rational and always sensible? And the answer is that we don't. We can't. Our brain would explode. We literally can't do it. So our unconscious drivers are heavily influenced by those three areas I talked about before: behavioral science, psychology, and neuroscience. But in the case of business and selling, it's neuroeconomics. So neuroeconomics is how you influence the brain to transact. What are the variables, the cognitive variables, the cultural variables, the gender variables, the psychographic, demographic, the geographic? What are all these variables from a neurological perspective that affect someone to transact? And basically, what we do is we talk about these three principles. And there's three fundamental principles that I teach, that I stand by. And it's from a lot of work and publications that I've read, in some of my own publications, on these three basic principles, or fundamental principles of selling. And the first one is that we are all irrational. I'm not going to go into the details of that, but I'm going to talk about a few other things. I do talk about these in detail when I teach, but I wanted to cover a lot more for you guys. We don't actually know what motivates people. Quite often, we don't even know what motivates us. Why did we do that? What made us, or what drove us, or what triggered us to make that decision? We call them nudging. Call it nudging. What is it that we do that has caused us to buy that? And no one likes to think. And this is a big one, because I get often, oh, don't be ridiculous, Leanne. Of course we want to think. How did I get all my academic stuff if I didn't think? We do it, but we don't like it. And so we find ways to make shortcuts. And that is how we operate. Our brain is the most metabolically expensive organ that we have. So it is doing so much work that we have to make shortcuts, and these are called mental heuristics. Now, I've put this slide in. Now, I did mention initially that the most common word that you hear when you are selling or buying or transacting is no. And often we are thinking no and activating our primitive brain before we even listen to the whole explanation of how a product or service is going to help us. And that comes down to an emotional response. So 93% of all decisions that we make are emotional and 7% are logic. The example I often use, just to give it context, is that I'll go in and I'll buy a pair of shoes. I see a pair of shoes. I love a pair of shoes. Do I need them? Absolutely not. I've got so many pairs of shoes. It's not funny. But I love these particular pair, and I will justify. So I've got this emotional attachment, and I will justify it by saying, oh, they're on special, or they're a different color, or they've got a thicker heel, or some kind of characteristic that will make me think, oh, there's got to be a justification for me to buy the shoes. And off I go. And of course, I'll go to the store with the shoes.
Need the shoes.
Where are you going to get the shoes? I was always getting the shoes. I was never not getting them. I just had to go through that irrational process of what I could justify about why I'm going to buy them. So there is a very famous researcher and experiment, and it's continuing. It's going on. I also spoke in the Neuroscience Roundtable about this. It's by Professor Brian Knudsen from Stanford. They're doing a lot of work on behavioral economy and neuroeconomy. And this research that they've done is just unbelievable. It's outstanding. And because of the results that they got, they are continuing the research. And so the first part of the study was that they got a group of people and they put them into an fMRI, which is a functional MRI. Now, for those of you who don't know what an MRI is, it's like a CT scan, but it uses a magnetic field to take images of your body. So you go into sort of a cone or a coil or a bit of a tunnel. It's a bit deeper than a CT scan. And there is, you hear the whooshing and it's quite noisy. And it's the magnetic field revolves and it creates images that you see. So we can see, in this case, the brain in a lot of detail. We use it a lot for diagnostic purposes because of the resolution, the density of what we see is so good. So we can see componentry of the brain in detail. A functional MRI is where we see the function of the brain. So we see different parts of the brain light up when it is exposed to certain stimulus. So what he did is he got a group of participants that obviously consented to be part of the study, and he put them through the MRI. It's non-ionizing radiation because it's magnetic. And he showed them different stimuli. So he showed them initially the picture of a product. So we have two activation sections. We, again, just as a recap, we have our prefrontal cortex, which is the oxytocin, makes us feel good. And then we have our pain areas or our protection areas, which is the back of our brain, our primitive brain, which secretes cortisol, which is our stress hormone. So we've got at the back, the stress area, at the front, the enlightenment area. So our pain and pleasure, let's call it that for this instance. So he showed a picture of a product. So for me, Vance showed a picture of a shoe. So of course we looked at the images, and on the front of the brain activated. So our pleasure centers activated, the prefrontal cortex was engaged, and we got in an oxytocin rush. Fabulous. The second part, he then showed a picture of sort of a shop, going into a shop. He showed maybe a sequence of images of people going into browsing in a shop. So there's intention to transact and to buy something. Again, pleasure centers lit up. So the front of the brain, oxytocin rush, fantastic. Then he showed the third part, which was actually the transaction. So he showed a picture of currency or a price tag or a product with a price tag or a checkout. So that activation of, transacting. And all the researchers thought, and Brian Knudsen in himself, who's an unbelievable neuroscientific genius, they were expecting the prefrontal cortex to activate again, because you're buying something, it's something that you like and love.
Yeah.
But what happened was the exact opposite. The primitive brain and the pain center activated. And so the stress hormone upregulated and the pleasure hormone downregulated. And they didn't expect to see this. And obviously they went on and did other tests, but the conclusion to that part of the study was, we are actually afraid to transact. We're actually afraid to sell. We're afraid to buy. We're afraid to part with money. We have this emotional connection with money and with losing something that outweighs anything that we gain. It's actually called loss aversion bias, but just as a side note. So where we thought, oh my gosh, where they're going to be so happy, they actually weren't. So technically, they didn't want to buy. So what happens for us, we need to make sure that we have conversations and engage with people in the space that is collaborative, that takes the sense of transaction away from the transaction. So I've just got two little brains here where we've got cortisol going through the roof, but what we want, and panic, is we actually want the brain to go, oh, that's a great idea, and I'm going to continue. So I put this in for you, Adrian, because I know when you listened to my previous talk and presentation with the neuroscience group last year, you really liked this. So what happened is we came up with a formula of likelihood of purchase, which they call the purchase formula. And it's basically comes down, it's very simple. The amount of reward activation, so the amount of the oxytocin and how much we activate our prefrontal cortex over the amount of pain activation and our stress hormone. So if we can engage with our buyer, our consumer, and remove the feeling of transaction or the feeling of them parting with their hard-earned cash or their money, whatever it is, and actually show them what it's going to do to help them to activate that oxytocin, it's a no-brainer. They will say, okay, I will work with you, or okay, I will buy that. The transaction has to be secondary. So the way that we can activate the prefrontal cortex is by using certain things called nudging, or looking at, nudging is the main thing, but looking at the way that we have interactions and the way we have conversations with people. So looking at the interaction dynamics. It also indicates a level of trust that we operate, which you brought up before, and also how we can bond. And how, now I'm not talking about bonding as in smoochy, lovey-dovey. I'm talking about collaborating and seeing a win-win situation. So for me, I'm engaging with a new client. I make sure that firstly, they are comfortable and they are happy with what I'm proposing before I even discuss. And it may be 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 conversations down the track that we actually start talking about the transaction. I make sure that that is set and they are in a fully prefrontal cortex state, but also as the expert and as the buyer and you guys on the call as the people that are selling, it has to be good for you as well. So it needs to be a win-win situation. So it can't be all for the buyer and not for you. So we go into, whoops, that's your next question. Sorry. We go into transactional, positional, and transformational conversations.
You bring up here the outcomes produced by the conversations, and you talk about how those conversations are so important. And so that really does go into our next question, which is, what are the connections between the 5 brains and conversation?
Yeah. So, So, I mean, people look at me and go, oh, it's just having a conversation. No, it's not. So there is an area of science called conversational intelligence, which I teach. Now, it's not emotional intelligence. It's a whole nother a bunch of levels up from that. Oh. Basically, it is engaging in and understanding how we can communicate to activate the prefrontal cortex. So I'm going to very quickly go through the 3 levels, just give you examples so you understand. But we've got level 1, which is transactional, level 2, which is positional, and level 3, which is transformational. Now, level 1, which is transactional, will activate the primitive brain and your amygdala straight away. No business is done in a transactional conversation. So an example would be, how can I help you? I would like to this, and this. Great product. Would you like to buy it? That now we all know that is going to activate our amygdala and push us away. It's like, well, hang on. You don't even know me. You don't know exactly what I need. You don't know what my problem is. You haven't asked any questions. You haven't engaged. You don't understand. So we will automatically go into protection mode. Yeah. So that level 1 conversation, which is called transactional, which is funny that it's called transactional because it is purely a transaction, will never transact. Level 2 is positional, where we start exchanging. So we would say, oh, hi, how are you? How can I help you? I'm looking to purchase, let's use a TV. I'm looking at purchase TV. Oh, okay, sure, no worries. Is there a size that you're thinking about? Whereabouts are you going to be watching your TV? Is it for the family? Is it just for you? Do you watch sports where you might need something that's a little bit of a sharper image? You start engaging and asking questions. Now, initially, the person will be in the back. You're starting to bring them to the front because you're positioning the conversation where they need to say, actually, it's going to be in the games room downstairs for the kids. They want to play their Xbox, da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. They might then say, I don't want you to offer me the most expensive TV, where you'll come back and say, absolutely not. I'm just here to understand exactly what would best fit your needs. We then move on to the level 3 conversation. So we've actually got them in the prefrontal cortex there to keep them. We go to level 3, which is transformational, which is actually an exchange of energy. And I've got here share and discover. So we then extend that conversation by saying, actually, the most expensive TV would be this, which wouldn't be suitable for you. I think that's way too, it's too much. It's not economical, blah, 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 blah. But I want to really understand what's going to give you the best viewing experience, movement, image, picture quality for a price that's within your budget. Do you mind if I take you to show you a couple of TVs? What I did there, and this goes on and on, is ask permission. We no longer ask permission. We land in people's inboxes without asking permission. We try and sell to them without knowing if it's okay to sell to them. We engage on LinkedIn. I mean, Adrian, you'd be the same as me. We receive, I laugh because I receive so much correspondence, and I think if they only just read my profile and saw what I did, they wouldn't actually write or ask the questions that they're asking. But they land in on different social media platforms and automatically think or push you to transact. Of course, what happens? The first thing: block, delete, don't answer. Bunk. We just have forgotten to ask permission. Now, this person may not want to look at these TVs, but ask them. If you ask them, the likelihood of it happening is yes, because you're building that trust. As you then ask permission and you show them, you are likely to then transact at the end of that. So very briefly, Adrian, I want to make sure, I don't know if anyone's got any questions, but make sure that people sort of have a brief understanding or high-level understanding of the level 1, which is transactional, level 2 is positional, level 3, which is transformational. I said right at the beginning of this webinar that the transaction is secondary. That is a perfect example of showing that the transaction is secondary.
Oh, absolutely. Okay, well, let's move on to our next question. Which is, how do the 5 brains influence selling? Which you've given a wonderful overview of, but I think we've got a bit more detail here in this slide.
Yes. So what I've done here with this slide is this is actually a neuroscience dashboard, and what I've done is we've put it together, showing from distrust to trust. Which is coming right back and circling back to what you were saying initially with neuromarketing, and how distrust is where it's the back of our brain, and we have our stress hormones and we protect ourselves, going to trust, which we feel great, activate our pleasure centers, and we start partnering, which is technically the transaction. There are 5 phases that the brain goes through: a resistor, skeptic, wait and see, experimental, and co-creator. And what we want to do is move people through these so we then build a relationship and do business. So the resistor area is where, when I was giving the example of the transactional, do you want to buy this? It's like, hell no. This is also the no. This is the Brian Knutson in the fMRI showing the picture of the price tag and of the cash register, where people immediately were like, absolutely not. So we've got to move them from that to skeptics, like, oh, okay, I don't think so. But it's it's not a definite no. To a wait and see, where I engage with the television example of asking questions about what the function of the TV was for and what they need and where it's going to be and the size. And it's like, hang on, this person hasn't just said, what do you want? They're actually asking me questions and engaging with me to find out a bit more about me and what matters to me. So I'm just going to wait, see what questions they ask, answer them, and then move on. We go to what then is called experimental, which is, do you mind if, or is it okay if I show you a couple of televisions? Sure, we're experimenting now. Let me go and have a look. Let's see. We've got this one, we've got this one, but then I said, I don't want you to sell me the most expensive. And I said, no, actually, that wouldn't be suitable for you. In fact, that's that would be a waste of money. You want something that's a little bit more economical, but okay, we're experimenting. And then as we move along, we go, so I think this one, which is this within your budget? It does this, it does this, it does this. The kids will love it. They can play their Xboxes. You'll be able to watch sport. You'll be able to do this. Great for Netflix. Fantastic. And then you actually get that pleasure center activation and then transact. So when we influence, we use a lot of what we call use cognitive biases. So, for instance, I'm actually going to stop the slide. I'll just talk to you here. Is quite often we will expect to walk into a store. I do this, and I even know what stores this is going to happen to. In fact, I'm sure we've all stopped. We've gone to go into a shop and stop because we know that we're going to be hounded by a sales assistant wanting to sell.
Yeah,
so our amygdala is actually activated before we even step in. It is activated so strongly that it stops us from taking that next step, and we keep going. We keep walking.
That's true. Yeah.
So it is all about, you using our cognitive biases, which happen naturally and subconsciously, of what is it that could potentially happen here. So I have had an experience of walking in this store before and been bombarded by a salesperson, so I'm not going to do it again. Or I had a really nice experience here, so I'm going to give it a go and actually step in. So influencing behaviors is there are certain ways that we can influence, and when we start nudging behaviors and start using tools where we engage with someone to make them feel good. There are two reasons why someone buys something, and it's very simple. We overcomplicate it, but it's actually very simple. It's to feel good and to solve a problem. That's it. To feel good and to solve a problem. There's nothing else. But the feeling good part is the emotional part. So if we just make someone feel good, and before we even start getting into a transaction, then we're starting to move them into the front. So asking someone, how are you? Asking them, how's your day been? Happy New Year. Just starting off a conversation that has got nothing to do with your product and service. In fact, I generally say don't even talk about your product and service until your third or fourth conversation that you have with someone. Activates that pleasure center and starts to build trust. So I've got here a bias called anchoring. Our decisions are influenced by the first information we see. So if we're not going to go into this study, the roulette study, very famous study, but basically in a situation, how you are presented or how you are seen by your customer or your potential client in the first instance will influence the interaction they have with you next.
Right. And you hear about that, people to have their take their point of view of who you are in the first 5 seconds or something.
Yeah, so that's from presentation. So that is part of what we call the mental heuristics, so shortcuts. So what mental heuristics are is I normally draw a circle and then there's dots. So the circle is full of information that we need to consume, but then we put just dots, and that is just around the circle. So it might be a full circle and we put, say, 6 or 7 dots around the circle. And that's the information that we take in. But what happens with the gaps in between the dots, where there is information that's important, we actually make it up. So we fill in the gaps ourselves. They're called limiting beliefs. They're called assumptions. 90% of assumptions are incorrect. Because when we fill the gaps in that suit us, that fits our situation, that fits what we want it to be like. But unfortunately, the majority of the time, it's incorrect. So what we want to do as a business is reduce the size of those gaps. But so if someone's going to walk in and assume by filling in the gaps that they're going to be sold to, and all of a sudden we don't, those gaps totally change. Go, hang on, I was expecting this, but I didn't get that. I'm now open for a lot more information. I'm now open to have a lot more conversation. I'm now open technically to transact.
Well, that's amazing. There's so much to consider there. but you make it seem very simple, but then there's so much behind it.
Look, there is. Our brains are interesting and intriguing and amazing organs, and we all have our own geniuses and talents, and it's breaking that down and understanding how the brain works from the wisdom of 5 brain perspective, not an anatomical perspective.
Yeah.
Our hormones that are obviously produced by our brains fluctuate constantly. And managing that fluctuation, or what we call up and down regulation of hormones, is how we do great business. So the 2 main ones being the primitive brain and our prefrontal cortex, which has our stress hormone and our feel-good hormone. If we can manage that and activate in our customers and consumers it's almost, I don't really want to sound, that doesn't sound right, but it's almost like being a puppeteer. Even though in a nice way, we're moving the arms and the legs, we're actually, moving the dial from the back to the front of a consumer's brain by giving them an experience, by, having these conversations, by using cognitive biases, by nudging them in a certain way. I teach this in a massive big course, which it's hard to do in an hour, but it's it's engaging people in a way that makes them comfortable and makes them want to be around you to know more. And that is by simply initially asking questions and knowing that you're not going to be, salesy or slimy, because sales is a dirty word. And it comes from that activation of protection, which is why that push away.
Yeah, I love that slide where you had resistance, skeptic, and went through that. That really clarifies the different stages that people go through.
Yes, the neuroscience dashboard. So they've broken it down. There's a lot of broken it down just to simplify it into five phases, and that is basically what we all go through. We actually go through those 5 phases with everything we do. They're just more prominent in a sales situation because we are heightened.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Well, thank you. Well, thank you so much. I think we have a final slide with your details here. Leanne, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you join us today at the Business Success Strategy session. And there's so much information. There will be a recording, and it'll be uploaded onto YouTube, and our attendees today will get a copy. And I think it's a recording that we need to go back and revisit and take in, because you shared so much valuable information.
No, thanks for having me, and I hope it's helped. I know it's just touching the surface and it's high level, but we've got to start somewhere, and it's understanding the mind and the neuroscience of how we sell that makes us very successful. And those techniques and those principles are in tune with how we naturally behave and think. For some reason, we've lost that rhythm, and we need to bring that back, because that is how great relationships and great business is done. And I always say that, I'm changing the way the world does business one brain at a time, because that's exactly how we work.
Thank you so much, Leanne, for having us. And
you're welcome.
to our attendees for joining us today.